Yo, check this out. This is Wayne Wonder, representing for Warwick LTV. You see the vision, don't it? See the vision. Warwick LTV. Keep it locked.
I'm gonna tell you. We, as bloggers, these are the issues that we need to address. You understand what I said? Set the bar for the youth. Share, like, and subscribe, and stay tuned to the channel. I don't know all this. Yes, I. Greetings once again in the mighty name of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I First, and all things good and wonderful amongst us. Welcome viewers and subscribers. Viewers, if you like the content, subscribe and make it go to the platform. You see. But as you don't know, we're in the birth month of FIRST RASTA man Leonard Howell. Seen, we are read some publication about him from in the past. Some very interesting read. But sound true to form to me, sound even and balanced. So I'm gonna get on with it again with the third reading. You see, this one named The Police Raid in 1941 and 1954. See? So I could get on with it quick and fast. You know. Welcome viewers and subscribers. Viewers, if you like the content, subscribe and make sure you go to the platform. You see, and thank you. Check out my cash app downstairs in the description. Alright. The police raid in 1941 and 1954. By the time that any leading figure in the labor movement of the 1930s began to voice objection to the Rastafari movement, Howell's popularity among the peasantry had grown to such an extent that in 1940, he could establish the community of Pinnacle, which had 700 residents. Howell had also reached a point where he felt enough confidence in the strength of his movement to take on the labor leadership, calling this a failure because it had not addressed the problem of race, which was obvious to him because of the fact that most of the island's poor people were black, and because the most prominent labor leaders by the late 1930s were not black. Alexander Bustamante, a brown-skinned middle-class Jamaican, had become the most visible labor leader as a result of the 1938 labor protests. He formed a union in that same year, the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, to which he gave his name and appointed himself as its presidential general. It was the strongest union in the island and the one that Howell criticized at a meeting he held in Port Moran on the 25th of June 1939. By the 6th of July, the same year, just 12 days later, Bustamante wrote a strong letter addressed to Woolley. In this letter, Bustamante called upon the colonial government to either imprison Howell again or send him back to the lunatic asylum in order to silence him, and gave this as his justification. Serious trouble is brewing at Port Maria in St. Thomas, owing to the mischievousness of a man whose name is Howell. Leader of this terrible thing is called Rastafari. Bustamante had benefited from the invitation by AGS Coombs to join his Jamaica Workers and Tradesmen Union in 1937. Hartley Nita has recorded how Bustamante had to be persuaded by Coombs, who was a militant Garveyite, according to Arnold Bertram, to join the union. However, in time, Bustamante also publicly turned his back on the ideology of black nationalism, which was embraced by earlier labor leaders such as Coombs. Instead, Bustamante chose to pursue the improvement of the working class and the decolonization of Jamaica through the British parliamentary system, and adopted the leadership style of charismatic authoritarianism, which made it impossible for him to view Leonard Howell as a fellow leader or as someone who had a legitimate claim to be one of the leaders of any portion of the Jamaican population. For Bustamante, Howell was incapable of leadership because he did not subscribe to the established order or traditional leadership model. He had no regard for the rules or for hierarchy, and he had no technical qualification to justify having a place in leadership. Almost the same position was taken by the press, which reported that Howell ruled his Pinnacle community like a tyrant. But what was almost never reported was that the community was under attack by intruders or by other poor people who joined to steal from the resident as well as from inhabitants of the surrounding communities. Howell became more concerned about security only after these intruders were discovered. He would put them on trial like a judge and ordered floggings and expulsions from the community. However, the message these actions sent to Howell's opponent only intensified their anxiousness to see him either jailed again or confined to the asylum for another period. The measures Howell took were never mentioned as security procedures. Almost nothing were printed in the press, which stated that Pinnacle community was itself under attack. Instead, Howell's methods were presented as evidence of extremism and the kind that only an unstable mind would adopt, and further proof that Rastafari movement was lunacy. For example, one of the representatives of the press, R.A. Levi, a writer for the leftist newspaper Public Opinion, which had close ties to Norman Manley, People's National Party, and National Workers Union, established in 1938, respectively, wrote a lengthy 4-part article that was published in the newspaper in 1943. These articles were based on an interview that Levy did with Howell in 1939 or 1940. And in the article, Levy wrote of telling Howell that millions, including myself, are still disbelievers, firm ironclad disbelievers in Rastafarianism, which was a statement of fact, but one that Levi presented to suggest that Howell's movement promoted an idea that many people, including Levy, consider as insanity, the belief that Selassie was the Son of God. By the time that these articles were published, Howell had already started Pinnacle, which was labeled a communist experiment by a reporter for the Gleaner. The Jamaica in which this reporter comment was published was far from an appreciative context for the communist ideology. Britain had just entered World War II in response to Germany's 1939 invasion of Poland, a context that made communism appear as an even more alien and extreme ideology to the Americans, who were British subjects and who lived in one of Britain's most important colonies. While there might have been tolerance for Norman Manley's Fabianism because of the British origin of this ideology, communism, which was viewed as more extreme, was a completely different matter. The mother country could not afford to fight a major war against Germany and Italy and then Japan, while at the same time battle the communist movement for independence in its Jamaican colony. As for Levy's article, they had also appeared in print after Howell's Pinnacle community was raided by the police on 4th of July 1941, and Howell had been sentenced to another 2 years at hard labor for assault. The article that Levy wrote represented an outrage against Howell and his encampment at Pinnacle development, which continued to raise concern in spite of the police raid and the sentencing of Howell, and along with 27 of his followers. The build-up to the raid started with Howell's announcement in 1939 of his intention to build a tabernacle for the purpose of divine worship and for schooling members of children of members. The Gleaner had publicized the announcement in its 27th December edition, only days after Howell had made the announcement. In the months before the raid, another newspaper, the Jamaica Times, published a story linked the people at Pinnacle to the assault and theft reported in Spanish Town capital at St. Catherine, the home parish of Pinnacle. It was obvious that this article was another fabrication. A man who was robbed of his bag of coal was interviewed by the reporter, and he had said that his assailant told him this: "Me and no Pinnacle man. Me no know nothing about them." The reporter nonetheless concluded that the assailant had the qualification of a Rastafarian, which meant that he looked unkempt. It was well known that Howell promoted cleanliness among his people and that he himself was almost never seen without his three-piece suit, and he kept his hair short and had only a mustache. It was 2 days after this article in the Jamaica Times was published that the police raided Pinnacle for the first time. The police contingent that went on this raid was comprised of 115 personnel, half of them armed, and their target was Howell. The police had used James Nelson, a man wanted for breaches of the firearms law, who was allegedly living at Pinnacle under Howell's protection, to justify the raid. Back in June of 1941, Nelson had written to the police in Spanish Town informing them that he could be found at Pinnacle, where he was in possession of ammunition. The address on this letter stated the post office in St. Thomas, which the police ignored. The fabrication became more obvious when Nelson was not found at Pinnacle on the day of the raid or any time after that. Howell was not found at Pinnacle either, but was taken into custody 11 days later when the police returned to the community during the night and found him at home in bed. An even clearer piece of evidence this was a fabricated campaign to suppress Howell by sending him to jail for another period was the way that the police gathered the witnesses who gave the testimonies used to convict Howell and 27 of his people. It was during the raid and after not finding Howell or Nelson that the police sent for residents from the neighboring communities of Simon, Crosspen, and Spanish Hole to identify the assailants who were convicted of assault. Moreover, the police were able to collect these testimony used at the trial without any apparent resistance from the people living in the surrounding communities, which housed mostly peasants. Howell could not escape conviction. On the basis of this evidence, he was well known as a leader of Pinnacle. Van Dyke has argued that the second police raid on Pinnacle, which took place on the 22nd of May 1954, occurred during a period when there was hardly any Rastafari agitation. Van Dyke. By this time, he meant that there was little confrontation with the colonial authorities or with any other groups in the society for that matter. But was this really possible at any point during Howell's leadership at the Rastafari movement? Pinnacle itself stood as a form of non-violent agitation. That is, if we can appreciate that it was more than an encampment, but also a manifestation of Howell's idea regarding self-government and self-reliance for black people. Honish has made this point clearer by referring to Pinnacle as a place where a microphysics of power was developed which organized the members of the commune under black control. Pinnacle even survived the 2 additional years that Howell spent in prison after the raid in 1941 and its establishment close to Sligoville, the first free village formed by ex-slaves in 1834, indicated that the community was Howell's route to symbolic continuation of the fight for African freedom in colonial Jamaica. The self-reliance had itself served as one of the enticement for people who joined the community. Members received plots on which they built houses made of wood with thatch roof and on which they cultivated food and crops for subsistence and sales. They also made household items such as mats and broom, and they burned coals for use in the community and to sell in the markets in Spanish Town and downtown Kingston. Howell also started a bakery which brought in cash. Pinnacle was similar to a maroon town in that it was self-governed. There was a communal dining room, and a place where everyone went to worship. If there was no agitation, no form of confrontation, then why would the newspaper, Public Opinion, published Levy article on the subject of Howell and his movement in 1943. The interview for these articles done from either 1939 or 1940. Constitutional charges was also pending and took place in the year following the publication of Levy's article. The island was at a crucial juncture in its political history and its nationalism, yet Howell and his people were still receiving attention in the press. Levy remarks in his article that most people were still disbelieved in the divinity of Selassie, implied concern over the doctrine as much as disagreement with it. Furthermore, Howell was still in prison for assault when Levi's articles were published, but he was still a subject of concern in the press. Why would the police also insist in the following year after Howell was released from prison that he should also be treated as a suspect in the death of his wife, Tineth Nee Bend, when no evidence implicating him in her death had been found? To say that this had nothing to do with agitation or an ongoing confrontation with the opponent of Howell's movement is to contradict available documentation. The Attorney General, who was called in to investigate if Howell could be locked up again, this time for a murder, did see the necessity for an investigation, but the conclusion that he reached, which he expressed with regret, was that he had no alternative but to enter a null enter a null. Lee's perspective, which is similar to Van Dyke, is also problematic. She states that the advice from the Attorney General and the police after Howell released from prison in 1943 suggests that there was unwillingness in the part of officialdom to take any further action on the matter of Howell's suppression, at least until the second raid in 1954. Among her main reasons for this view are the 1938 labor protests and the constitutional change of 1944, both of which had occupied the attention of the government. However, it is not likely that the government would have been less concerned about Howell in the midst of public interest while facing political transformation. It was Howell who had started a movement that was also comprised of poor, suffering people. Also true is that the first raid on Pinnacle had taken place only 3 years after the labor protests, which indicate that there was still anxiety within government about Howell and his movement, to which the parish board of St. Catherine contributed greatly with its report of unhygienic condition at Pinnacle between November 1940 and January 1941, which had possibly caused the illness of some 17 or 18 people who had entered the poorhouse in the parish, one of whom, according to a subsequent report, had died. In March 1941, this same board even investigated if it was possible to undermine Howell by seizing the assets of his Ethiopian Salvation Society, a friendly society established in 1937, which the board believed had provided at least some of the funds Howell had used in the arrangement to purchase Pinnacle from the Chinese businessman Albert Chang. Furthermore, there was a letter that Howell had sent to London in March 1939 addressed to the well-known Marxist George Padmore, and which contained a small £5 donation to the International African Service Bureau, which had introduced Howell's name to the British government and suggested that Howell was, from that year, thinking about expanding his movement beyond Jamaica. And publicly also thinking about linking the Rastafari to the Marxist ideology to at least gain support from Marxist intellects as well as from its other activities. The fact that this letter was intercepted was evidence of concern about Howell, not only Padmore, and the British government therefore sent a copy of the letter. Sent a copy of the letter to the government of Jamaica for its further consideration. In addition, between 1944 constitutional changes and the second raid in 1954, the Chief Minister of Justice was one of Howell's arch-rival, Alexander Bustamante. This second raid was delayed for more than a decade, simply because the government of Jamaica needed a final solution for Howell, one that was permanent. The search for this final solution began from the moment that Howell was released from jail following his imprisonment after the 1941 raid around the middle of 1943. Aiding the government was also the fact that World War II and its distractions had ended in 1945, and in just 3 years, the final solution was found in the form of the marijuana ban, introduced by an amendment to the Dangerous Drug Act in 1948. The House of Representatives, populated by the Labour leadership, supported this amendment. It appeared that everybody opposed to Howell supported this solution. And before the second raid, Howell said during a trial for a marijuana position at Sutton Street Court in Kingston, where Justice C.D. Fitchett was presiding, that he had up to 5 previous convictions for marijuana possession. Fitchett was unsympathetic and sentenced Howell to 12 months in prison in 1951 for the possession of marijuana. Lee makes another problematic suggestion, which implies that the second raid was a more spectacular event than the first one, and to support this view, she cites the massive deployment. In all, they numbered 5 supervisors, 5 detectives, 116 policemen, and a number of technical assistants. They had been thoroughly briefed and equipped with rifles, tear gas, riot button, walkie-talkies, 2-car radios, and HF radio unit, supported by a mobile water tank and canteen. Lee added 110 guilty verdicts which were handed down by the court for the possession of marijuana, and which the police has transported from Pinnacle to the courtroom as part of the spectacle. There was indeed a spectacle, but this was neither the deployment for the raid nor the way that the raid was conducted. The deployment was the means to the real end, and so was the trial. And the real spectacle was that Howell was found guilty, but was then released upon appeal. But a total of 110 of his people found themselves in the less fortunate situation. This was the way that the government, which was now partly colonial and partly nationalist, went about making sure that the final solution worked. The plan was to strip Howell of his influence by jailing his people. And even though he was released upon appeal, he was still the main target. His leadership was the main concern, and the police personnel, the equipment that they brought with them, the marijuana that they seized and presented in court, as well as the conviction of his people, were all part of making sure that Howell had no one left to lead. His movement had continued in spite of previous incarceration and even his confinement as a lunatic. Stripping him of the people he led, or at least a good portion of this following, was now seen as the only way to ensure that he was taken out of the national spotlight. Rastafari. Now in conclusion, you know, see it. In conclusion, we'll just conclude it another one and done, because conclusion is not that long. You know, see it. So in conclusion, Leonard Howell was the most victimized of the early Rastafari leaders due to his advocacy of the movement's doctrine as one of the most visible early leaders who preached the divinity of Haile Selassie. Howell may well be described as the very first Rasta, but in becoming the first Rasta, he needed to acquire a following, and it was this work of building the movement, a task that he started within months of his return to Jamaica from the United States in 1932, that in time would also making the main target of the effort to suppress the Rastafari movement. No one who opposed the movement in the 1930s and 40s and 50s held this position without having some sense of the work of Leonard Howell. Some understanding, however limited this might have been, of his advocacy of the Rastafari doctrine. The first major triumph of the suppression campaign was the 2 years at hard labor that Howell received from the Chief Justice of Jamaica in the courthouse at Morant Bay in 1934. Although with the 1 year at hard labor that was reserved for his Lieutenant Robert Hines, the highest court official in the colony had been sent all the way from the island's capital of Kingston to preside over the trial of the man who was regarded as a leading figure of the Rastafari, the man who was seen as having started this new religious movement, which many Jamaicans thought of as change, but which also promoted race consciousness and African solidarity and overall a radical African-centered philosophy. Howell was the one who was seen as having taken the Rastafari virtuality to the doorsteps of the executive of the judiciary of the colonial government, and for this role he was eventually made to face conviction for one of the most serious offenses that a civilian could be charged with by the government, the charge of sedition. Howell was sent to jail on this occasion because he was said to have been preaching to people about not pledging allegiance to the colonial government or to Imperial Britain. This kind of advocacy was seen not merely anti-colonial rhetoric, but as the preparation for a revolution, and possibly the one that would take place through violent means. And with this kind of implication, something urgent, something swift, and something effective had to be done to put a stop to Howell. He was already in the international spotlight by the people that the press had really gotten off the ground with their campaign to have him permanently suppressed back in 1932, when the Gleaner had announced Howell's return to the island as a deportation from an immigration offense. This newspaper could not have possibly predicted that this same man would, in almost no time, also become one of the most discussed persons on its pages. Howell began his preaching in late 1932 or early 1933, but only after he had been featured in the Gleaner as a black Jamaican male expelled from the United States. Take lime and make lemonade. The first story that was printed in the Gleaner was shown to be untrue based upon the discovery made by the police in 1936, but the Gleaner, which was soon joined by the other newspapers such as Public Opinion and the Jamaica Times, subsequently invested far more energy and resources into keeping their readers abreast of almost everything that could prove to the point that Howell was a menace to society. Even in 1936, when the colonial government and its police force had concluded that the matter of Leonard Howell had been put to rest, that organization that he led was dying, the campaign of the press was literally in full swing. Howell's incarceration for sedition had given support only to the government and the police. He had acquired other enemies who had been waiting in the background for their chance to publicize their own anxieties and outrage, and to participate in any undertaking that could bring about his permanent suppression. Ordinary citizens and organization, labor played a vital role in ordinary civilians and organized labor played a vital role in punishing Howell. We know that white and colored people in Jamaica were very anxious about Howell, that they saw him as the potential leader of another Morant Bay rebellion, and that they were eager to see the colonial government put an end to his activities. We also know that the Baptist Church was implicated in the anti-Howell campaign, which is somewhat shocking considering the fact that this same church was active in the struggle against slavery in the early 19th century. And as for organized labor, we know of the participation of Bustamante, who had turned away from black nationalism to embrace the less revolutionary Creole nationalism that, in due course, becomes the means through which Jamaica was decolonized and through which its independence was achieved in 1932. Now, when I create that to give something that was, inevitable, not to the people who demanded it, which was the black people, so that's it got on in history as a Jamaican black group who demanded decolonization. But what I did was created this Creole group to give it to and give them the credits. But anyway, we know what, we're not business. It was during Bustamante's term as Chief Minister of Jamaica that the second police raid took place on Howell's encampment at Pinnacle, which dealt the most serious blow to his movement. Participation in Howell's suppression by the leftist side of Creole nationalism was visible in the article written by Levy in Public Opinion in 1943, in which Howell was advised that most people saw his movement as strained and would never take the Rastafari as a serious religious organization. Unlike Bustamante, who proposed sending Howell to either jail or asylum, which implied that he was also fearful of Howell's influence and saw the latter as a contender for the leadership of at least the peasant population. Levi felt that Howell's influence would never spread beyond a few hundred Jamaicans, and most certainly would never spread beyond Jamaica. This part of the anti-Howell campaign was based on the belief that this movement continued to grow. Believe that this movement had nothing useful to offer black Jamaicans or black people from other parts of the world. But the Rastafari movement continued to grow. It survived Howell's death in New Kingston, Jamaica on the 25th of February 1981 and is today a global movement. Many thanks I do to Dr. Jalani Naya and Dr. Rachel Mosley Ward of the University of the West Indies, Mona, for their help with this article, and also to the anonymous reviewers who pointed out where other revisions were needed. I also wish to thank Monty Howell, Sister Hadesh, and the Howellites who introduced me to the vital, achievable material and consent to have me interview them for this article. Yes, So I eat that, and we hope we create a sense of, a picture, set knowledge, a sort of awareness, a sort of a bit of education regarding Leonard Howell in this time. You see, so all of this for this weekend publication, which is I and I birth weekend too. You see, so we give thanks. Rastafari. I never know, so I give thanks. Rastafari.